Chapter 2. February 14th, 1980. Whitechapel Funeral Home, Troy, Michigan, 12:55 p.m. Dawson Malowski's funeral was unlike anything John Chappell had ever seen. At the age of 6.5, he'd only been to one funeral before, his great-grandmother's, and that was an experience in itself. He'd never seen so many people crying in one room at one time, and more disturbing, he'd never seen a person so still and eerily quiet. His dad told him that he didn't have to go, but as a young man he said that it was his choice whether he wanted to pay his final respects. He was being a young man again instead of a little boy, and he wished that he hadn't gone. Everything about that day seemed more exaggerated and out of proportion than it had been for his grandmother's funeral. A boy of 2 got much more respect than his grandmother, and his mother told him that was because nobody ever expected a child to die, so it was a much more difficult thing. There was lots of crying, way more than he had heard before, and it was a different kind of crying. It was soft in stifled moderation, and with a gentle somberness before, but it was agonizing, loud and uncontrollable at this one. Both of Dawson's parents had broken down several times, and his mother even collapsed once on the floor and another time on a couch. John had never seen such a thing, never witnessed such overpowering sadness as that. He sat several rows back, behind the noisy family, again out of respect. From that distance he could barely see the small casket at the front of the room, especially hidden within the coloured canopy of flowers. It seemed funny to him that such a little person needed such a big place and so many flowers surrounding him. It took attention away from the fancy box and the boy inside, but then maybe that was the idea. Sitting quietly in a neat row on the very front couch, all dressed in crisp black, were Dawson's siblings and his best friends Dean, Steve and Melinda. The boys wore matching suits, and Melinda was covered in black from head to toe. She had black shiny shoes, black nylon leggings, and a black dress with matching sheer lace at the bottom and the shoulders. In her hair were 2 dark ribbons holding up her curled ponytails. He hardly recognized them, and as they looked at him when he walked past earlier, they didn't seem to recognize him either. Her small face was probably the saddest, and it troubled him as much as seeing the boy in the small box. Those eyes of hers had always sparkled at him, and were a mixture of beautiful blue, like pictures he'd seen of the Mediterranean Sea. Now they were a reflection of her black attire, making her look hollow and empty inside. Only days before she'd been chasing him around Raintree Park, laughing and giggling like girls that age tend to do. Her brothers, Dean and Steve, were playing football with the other boys there, and though they weren't giggling and carrying on, they were still having fun being boys. John had played ball with them many times, and it had only been roster cuts that benched him and left him at the mercy of their sister and her silly games. The boys in the park took their football seriously, and just like real football, they had playoff games as the weather turned colder. Playoff games were a very serious thing, and they couldn't afford to have smaller, lesser-skilled boys like John playing and fouling up their chances. Only the biggest, fastest, and most seasoned players were allowed to play late into the winter for those games, and John didn't take it personally. He wanted Steve and Dean's team to win. He didn't hate playing chase with their sister or her friend Gwen Lawson either, but he pretended to because he didn't want to ruin his chances for the next season's team. It was better being tackled by a pretty girl than being knocked flat on your back by a boy 3 years and 6 inches taller than you anyway. And Melinda Malowski was probably the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen in all his 6.5 years. She had beautiful golden ringlets of hair spilling down to the middle of her back, and thick pink lips filled with perfectly straight teeth that were always smiling at him, or hovering close to him as she spoke to him in whispers. Melinda rarely talked to anyone without leaning in close to whisper in your ear, as if everything she had to say was of utmost importance and top secret. Gwen found it obnoxious, and had no compunctions about talking loudly and saying whatever was on her mind. Gwen, by comparison, was not a beautiful little girl. She looked more like a boy, with her shorter reddish-brown hair, freckles, and unflattering outfits her mother dressed her in. She was proud that she could do everything a boy could do, sometimes even better. John liked spending time with her too, because she did neat things like climbing trees at the river's edge or teaching him how to catch frogs and skip stones. Melinda didn't like doing any of those things, and she would nearly burst into tears if she got a speck of dirt on her hands or on her dress. Gwen used this to her advantage, and as a way of trying to get John away from Melinda, luring him to the water's edge and getting dirty with him. Even at that young age, the pair constantly fought for his attention. Gwen knew that girls her age weren't supposed to like boys or do those things, but Melinda would always take it to the next level, where she couldn't go, just to win. That would never change between them throughout life. Melinda would try to win at all costs in that eternal competition between them, and Gwen would be limited by her morals. Melinda happened to beat her to the park the day the awful thing happened, and had him over by the fountain, giggling and laughing. Gwen saw them but didn't tell Melinda's mother where they were. She was a good friend, the both of them knew, and she never would have told on them, even to get one over on Melinda. John saw Gwen sitting closer to the front with her mother, dressed in a girl's outfit for probably the first time in her life. She wore a similar black dress, ribbons in her auburn hair, and he was pretty sure that she'd even been wearing lip gloss when he'd passed her earlier. He liked Gwen a lot, and that's why he felt awful for her for covering for him and Melinda both. They should have been watching him that day instead of leaving the responsibility entirely with poor Gwenny, and if they had been, he might not be up there in that fancy box. There were a lot of eyes that should have been watching that chilly February afternoon, but for some reason, all of them were on something else, and no one quite knew why. Dean and Steve were supposed to be most responsible, but they were too busy with their football, with it being playoffs and all. Next in line was Melinda, but she was too busy trying to get her daily dose of attention from the boy she had a crush on. That meant the responsibility fell to John, and since he was too occupied with what they were doing over by the fountain, that left Gwenny as the only set of eyes to watch Dawson. It should have been the responsibility of the adults. That's what John's mum said. And Margaret Malowski shouldn't have yelled at any of them the way she did when she was the one who didn't even show up that day. John would never forget the way she was trying to catch her breath in between sobs so that she could yell and curse at them as she rocked her son's lifeless body. And no matter what anybody said, he would always feel partially at fault. There wasn't a single adult anywhere near the large open field at Raintree that day, which had never happened before. All of the parents had gravitated towards the main field to watch the boys play their intense football game that day, and each thought someone else was paying attention to the children playing near the playground. That's what the argument was about after Dawson was found, and they all started showing up to see what the commotion was about. A mother held her son, and all around them shouting voices could be heard passing the blame of whose turn it was to be there. John got up from his seat at the very back, escorted by his mother up the narrow aisle so they could pay respects, and he noticed all of those faces watching him. Did they know where he was and what he was doing that day? Did someone make Gwen talk? He swallowed hard and turned his eyes back to the floor as they made their way to the front. Finally, stopping at the casket, his mother squeezed his hand tightly, prompting him to look at the small metal box and the boy inside. Staring down at his expressionless face made him feel as cold as he'd felt wading through the icy water days before when they'd first found him. They heard Gwen's blood-curdling scream from across the park and immediately started running toward her. Melinda's shorter legs couldn't keep up, and she almost fell as he dragged her across the snowy field by the hand, and he had to leave her behind to reach Gwen fast. The other boys had no idea what was going on at first, and they thought it was more of their silly girl games until John started yelling for Dean and his brother. They came next and arrived in time to see John immersed up to his waist in icy river water. "Where is he? Where is Dawson?" Dean demanded, who'd arrived first. Melinda could only point silently, her throat almost completely closed off by fear. "He's in the water!" Dean shrieked at her, terror in his voice. "You were supposed to be watching him, damn it!" Dean rarely swore, and John had only heard him curse once before when he had gotten hurt badly in football. Steve was already taking off his thick vest and wading into the water to retrieve him from John, who clutched him close to his chest. He held Dawson's wobbly head up in his hands as Dean dropped to his knees beside him. "He doesn't look good. He's blue. He's not breathing." Gwen stood by the icy water, rubbing her arms for warmth, and he shouted back to her, "Gwenny, how long has he been in there?" She wouldn't even look at him. Dean repeated the question louder. "Gwenny, damn it! How long?" There was the third time he'd heard him curse. She jerked her head up and just shook it at him, still too terrified to move. Steve unzipped Dawson's jacket and put his face close to his chest to listen for a heartbeat, and a breath that wouldn't come. "I don't know how to do this, John," the older boy choked out, beginning to panic. "I don't know how to do it. Do you?" He shook his head and looked at the boys that had gathered behind them, demanding, "Where are all the parents?" One of the boys, who was a year older than Steve, broke from the circle in a full run to find a grown-up, while Dean slapped his brother's chest a couple of times and breathed into his mouth. He'd only seen it done once on a TV show, but had never paid much attention. "What's that thing you do when someone chokes on food?" John held up his hands. "I don't know, Dean. I don't know that stuff." Dean repeated the bad word and said something about him being older and supposing to know more than him, which was true, but only by a few months, and they had been in the same grade. Steve lifted his little brother several times in jerky motions, his head bobbing back and forth and a gurgling noise coming from his mouth. "This is supposed to get the stuff out of his throat. This is supposed to work. It's not working." Steve began to sob. "Why is it not working?" As John watched Dean and Steve trying to make their brother breathe again and heard the girls squealing in the background, he turned in a circle looking for help from someone, from anyone. The boy who'd gone to find an adult seemed like he'd been gone for a long time and hadn't returned. He noticed then, above the tree line, the old building that he'd seen dozens of times. It was always just part of the background, and he'd seen it so many times that he'd never paid attention to the sign that gleamed in the darkness beyond the trees. He looked down at Dawson, who wasn't responding, and everyone around him seemed as frozen as he was. He couldn't know then that they were petrified by shock. He only knew that someone had to do something. He bent down and scooped him up, clutching the blue jacket tightly to him, and puffed at the other kids. "It's a hospital. There," he indicated with a nod towards the trees. "Go," Dean whispered. "You can make it." That was all the confirmation John needed, and he started at a dead run, carrying Dawson under his arms towards the trees. His adrenaline was pumping, and his blood was being chased through his veins by sheer terror, so that he didn't even feel the branches whipping at his face and tearing at his flesh. The fear that had once frozen him in place now moved his legs for him and gave his small arms the strength to do what he normally couldn't. He broke from the edge of the woods and came into a clearing that was divided by a small, landscaped ditch. There was no pain in his ankle when it wrenched sideways as he struggled to make his way up the hill towards the hospital parking lot. It just gave out on him. He fell, twisting to one side to shield the unconscious boy from the ground. The wind knocked out of him. He tried to stand again and pick Dawson back up, wiping the water from his eyes that burned and blurred his vision. The water was coming again as he stood peering into the metal box, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand, subconsciously touching the raised mark on his cheek with his fingertips. It would heal within a week and not leave a scar, but he would somehow always know it was there. His mother also dabbed at her cheek with a tissue as she said a quiet prayer, and then she led him away as he craned his neck to get one last look at the boy. They passed the Malowskis once more, and his mother bent to whisper some kindness to Margaret, placing her free hand on her shoulder. She nodded and thanked her, but sounded as if she was speaking from the bottom of a well. Dennis barely noticed they were there, and he stared blankly ahead at a place somewhere among the arrangement of flowers. It was only the third time he'd ever seen Melinda's dad, and he looked progressively worse each time. The last time had been at the edge of the parking lot at Beaumont Hospital, where he'd stumbled with his son on the snowy hill. He was among the first of the adults to arrive. Wearing khakis, a t-shirt, and muddy socks, he'd run all the way to the park-in, not stopping to grab his shoes. It was a far cry from the sharp suit, neatly combed hair, and polished dress shoes he'd been wearing the time before, and instead of towering over them all, seeming like the biggest man at the park, he looked frail, small, and bent at weird angles. His glasses had fogged up, hiding the full range of anguish and confusion in his eyes. It wasn't until he took them off to get a look at his son that John saw his eyes were red, beady, and scrunched under lots of wrinkled skin. Dennis was older than his wife. John knew that, but he looked to be about 80 that day. His mouth was drawn down in a permanent frown, and he saw an extra chin jiggle as he cried out his son's name repeatedly, trying to revive him. He hadn't seen Dennis Malowski since that day, but his eyes were still red and weighed down by wrinkled, heavy folds. The permanent frown was still there, and his chin still jiggled as he mouthed words unheard to his son. He didn't even acknowledge John or his mother, and Marge had to speak for the both of them whenever someone stopped to talk with them. The boys, Dean and his older brother Steve, were seated next to them, and each nodded as he passed but were afraid to speak to him. having witnessed the incident between John and their mother. Once the funeral was over and they were safely out of her sight, they freely associated with him at the house, where the extended family had gathered to put together a dinner for everyone. The mood was a bit less somber, except in those corners of the house where Dennis and Marge sat. Only the bravest among the family attempted to console or even speak to them, and that suited them just fine, because they preferred the solitude of those quiet corners as family milled about. John was introduced to dozens of people who squeezed, kissed, or pinched his face. "That's how Pollock parties go," one of the older men explained to him, after John had received his 5th face pinching. Melinda's grandmother was the only one who didn't squeeze or pinch him. She was actually very kind to him. She sat and talked with him for a long time about all sorts of things, and when she had finished, she told John, "You had best go find Melinda and be with her. She will need you in this tough time. She told me that the two of you were very good friends." John nodded, not realizing until that very moment that she was probably one of his best friends, along with Dean and Gwenny. Very good friends take care of one another in times like this. When times are sad and the world seems bleak, she will need someone like you, John, she said, touching his face with a cupped hand before sending him upstairs to find her. He never forgot that kind old woman's words, and he felt like he had just been given the most important job in the world. She had left Melinda in his care, and it was now his duty to look out for her as her best friend. Even though he had never met the old woman before that day, he felt like she knew everything about him by what they had discussed. It was as if she could somehow see into his heart, and she was the only one at the house that day who had seen the same darkness in Melinda's eyes, and not been too lost in her own grief to notice. John headed upstairs, gripping the large railing in his small hand as he took 2 steps at a time. Everything seemed so large where the Malowskis were concerned. Their house was huge and decorated with big paintings and rugs. Their cars were big and roomy, and the staircase he was climbing was ridiculously over-decorated with Christmas lights still wrapped around the banister, and picture frames following him all the way up. At the top, he found himself standing at the end of a long, intimidating hallway full of doors. Each door was closed, and he could only guess what was behind each of them. He knew Melinda's room was at the end of the hall and looked out over the neighbour's pool to the west side. He walked slowly down the hall and felt the eyes of the dozens of other portraits follow and watch him as he approached her door. He rapped lightly on it and pushed it open. She was sitting at her vanity on the opposite wall and was staring back at him in the mirror. Tears were still streaming down her face, and she was brushing out her ponytails, though the curls snapped back into place as soon as the brush passed through them into those tight ringlets. He loved her curly hair and hoped that it would stay that way forever. John stood in the door awkwardly, staring down at his own shiny shoes. "You can come in," she said plainly as if she didn't care that he was there. He stared at her in the vanity mirror and watched as she brushed her hair methodically. It was far too large for such a small girl, like everything else in the house, and there was an excess of hair ties, bows, and jewellery scattered on the giant thing. Her legs dangled off of a large plush velvet stool, and she wasn't even sitting all the way back in it. He imagined that she would grow into it someday, though he could never picture her growing older than the age she was now or any taller. To her left was another oversized piece of furniture painted to match her vanity, bureau, armoire, and twin matching nightstands. The large canopy bed had painted pristine white posts and sheer curtains tied back to each, which hung down from the top of the bed. A giant gathering of stuffed animals of every sort was piled high at the headboard, and still there was probably enough room for 3 adults, yet it was all there for little Melinda. "How are you doing?" John blurted out nervously. "I'm fine," she whispered. John thought hard about his next words, unsure of which order he wanted to say them. He wanted to tell her that she was his best friend, more than Dean, Gwen, or anyone else, and he didn't know if she knew that. The kiss also still lingered in his mind, and he'd wanted to ask her about it too, but it was most likely the last thing on her mind. He would never forget it, although part of him felt selfish for even thinking about it at a time like this. It had been their first special moment together, and it lasted all of 8 seconds until that piercing scream echoed across the snow-covered treetops. Everything else from that day was fogged over like an icy windshield in his memory, except that moment. It was a small eternity packed into a few seconds, as his heart pounded in his ears while her soft lips were pressed against his. "It wasn't your fault," he finally blurted out. "Dawson wasn't your fault, Mel." She stopped brushing her hair and turned to look at him with her blank eyes. "I know. My mother said it was your fault." John's face turned white. "My fault? I wasn't anywhere near him." She turned on her stool to look directly at him. "She said it was... I didn't. I told her that you were getting a drink with me at the fountain." "You didn't tell her?" John became frightened then at the prospect that she had shared their awkward, intimate moment with her mother. He'd wanted it brought up at some point to discuss it with her, but not like that. "No, I told her we were getting a drink. That's what we were doing," she said, then quickly changed the subject. "She said you were the oldest and you should have been more responsible." John turned from white to red and stammered, "More responsible? Dawson wasn't my responsibility, he was your brother's. Dean passed him off on us every time to play his stupid football. Where was he?" "That's just what she says. She says you were responsible for all of us." She hopped down from the vanity and stepped up onto the stool to sit beside him on the bed. "I don't believe that. It's just what she says. I heard my aunt talking to my other aunt, and she says my mother is just trying to find someone to blame to cover her own guilt. Whatever that means." She patted his hand and squeezed it tight. "It's not our fault, John. You're my best friend, and I don't want you to ever think I blame you, okay?" He was glad that she at least brought that part up, because he didn't think he could tell her now that there was a lump in his throat and his eyes were burning. Rubbing her small hand with his thumb quietly, he noticed her neatly manicured and painted nails. Everything was so perfect about her, he thought, and too good for him. His own nails were rough-hewn and bitten down. He lived in a small house with small things, and his dress socks didn't even match. One was black and one was dark blue. Looking in the mirror, he noticed how ragged he looked in comparison to her and felt small next to her despite being older. "Where did he go?" Melinda asked sheepishly. "Where did my baby brother go?" John thought about it for a while and remembered the conversation his grandmother had with him before her death. "Heaven, I suppose. That's where people go when they die. My grandma went there, and she's with God now," he explained, regurgitating the answer he'd been given. Melinda frowned. "Is that where we go, John, all of us?" He nodded. "Sure we do. Where else would we go?" "My brother told me, Stephen, that if we're not baptized before we die, we go somewhere else," she explained in an eerie whisper. He scrunched up his brows, a bit confused, blurting out in defiant disbelief, "Melinda, your brother didn't go to hell. Children don't go to hell. Why would your brother tell you that?" "He's scared that Dawson went there. Mum and Dad never took him to get him baptized. None of us have been baptized, John. What if something happens to us?" She was getting worked up by the thought. The tears came again, and she squeezed his hands hard. "Children go to heaven, Melinda. Baptized or not. My grandma told me that, and she knows way more about church than your brothers do. She went for 60 years. She should know," he reassured her. "I don't want to go. I don't want to die. I don't want to go to a bad place." She was whimpering against his shoulder, getting his white shirt wet with tears and snot. John didn't know what to say to convince her that she wasn't going to die. After all, nothing had prevented that from happening to Dawson. Why couldn't it happen to any of them at any time? She looked up at him with her big red-rimmed pools of blue, her long lashes dripping with droplets of water. "John, please come get me." He wrinkled up his nose at the statement, not sure what she meant. "Come get you?" "Yes, I'll come and get you. Where are you going?" She sobbed. "Come and get me." "Will you come up and get me if I die too? You're my best friend. Please don't leave me there." She wanted him to promise that he would just walk up to heaven and pick her up like it was somewhere you could just visit any day of the week. Her young mind couldn't grasp concepts like heaven, a soul, or mortality, and even he had difficulty processing it. She shouldn't have needed to understand something as complex as death at her age, and she was a scared little girl. Instead of attempting to explain it, though, he promised her, "If something happens to you, I will come and get you. I will come and be with you, no matter where you are." 2 months later, he would have to renege on his promise because he was moving away from the city to live with his father. His mother had half-heartedly fought him at first, but eventually conceded and agreed that it might be too much for their son to handle seeing the people and places that would remind him of his traumatic experience. When he arrived home one day after school, she'd already packed his things for him, and suitcases were by the door. He panicked and screamed at his mother, telling her that he couldn't leave Melinda, and ran from the house as fast as he could. It was the beginning of May, and the heavy rains had returned. John ran through them so fast that he thought he could outrun those drops, just as he thought he could outrun his fate. He ran 4 blocks to Melinda's house, and when Steve met him at the door and told him she wasn't there, he ran another 3 to Raintree. She was there, sitting on the picnic table alone. "What are you doing here?" he asked between gulps of air. "My parents were fighting again. They fight all the time." "What are you doing here in the rain?" "My mom wants to send me away to my dad's house." She stood back and screwed up one of her eyes at him. "Can't you come and visit? You're still going to come and see your mom, right?" "I can come visit you when you do." He shook his head and stood with his hands on his hips, still catching his breath. "No. My mom wants me to go because of you and your mom. She thinks it's bad for me to be around you and her. After I'm gone, she plans on moving away too. She says starting over will be good for both of us." "What are you saying? Why would she do that?" "You can't just not ever see me again. You're my best friend. Did you tell her that?" she shrieked, beginning to panic too, and grabbed both of his hands in hers. "What are you going to do? What are we going to do?" "I don't know, Melinda. She won't listen to me. She thinks I'm messing up in school because of this, because of you and everything else. Maybe I can go for a little while and do really good in school and show her I'm better. Then I can come back." "No, you can't leave me alone, John. I can't be here without you. My mum and dad fight all the time. Steve and Dean always stay after school so they don't have to come home, and I'm all alone. She won't even let me play with Gwenny anymore. I don't have anyone but you." John looked up at the tall canopy far above them, watching the raindrops making their way through the thick network of leaves and branches. That canopy was supposed to be a sanctuary from the rain and make those beneath it feel safe. But that park didn't make either of them feel safe any longer. It had been their own special place, but with the death of her brother, and with it now becoming the stage upon which their last goodbyes would be said, it was ruined forever. He didn't have an answer to give her. He didn't have the words. He knew he'd made a promise to her to be there for her and be her best friend, but he couldn't keep his promise, and it was breaking his heart. "No matter what, I'll come back for you. They can't keep us apart forever," was all that he could say as he watched that heavy rain force its way through the leaves above them. She whimpered, "You'll be gone for a long time. You'll forget all about me." John shook his head. "No. I'll never forget about you. I'll call you and write to you every day." His mother showed up then and didn't look happy. She had been driving and walking in the rain and was drenched. He stood and had planned to run, taking a firm grip of Melinda's hand, but decided it would only make things worse. Instead, he said goodbye to her, holding her tightly until the moment he felt the strong hand at the back of his shirt collar. His eyes never left her, even under a barrage of curses by his mother, until the car took him far away from her.